If you picture like the ultimate American hermit, a very specific image probably comes to mind.
Oh, definitely.
You know, it's the rugged, isolated nature boy, the guy uh, who just turns his back on society entirely, walks deep into the pristine wilderness.
Right, builds a cabin with his bare hands.
Exactly. Builds the cabin, lives purely off the land, and is just, completely self-sufficient and totally alone.
It is a deeply romantic and honestly incredibly persistent American myth.
Yeah.
Like this lone philosopher out in the woods representing total independence from the machine of modern society.
But the thing is, the man who practically invented that myth-like, the ultimate historical icon of going off-grid, he actually lived just a mile and a half from his family home.
Yeah, not exactly the deep wilderness.
No, not at all. He regularly walked back into town just to have dinner with his parents. And that famous nature lover, he once accidentally burned down like 300 acres of the local woods.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And the fierce anti-government rebel spent exactly one night in jail before someone just quietly paid his bail. Oh, and the legendary writer's first book. It was such a massive commercial flop that he had to buy back over 700 unsold copies himself, out of his own pocket.
Yeah, the pristine myth kind of just completely gives way to a very messy, highly contradictory reality the second you actually look closely at the historical record.
So welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. Our mission today is to essentially deconstruct that myth.
Right, we're taking a stack of historical journals, letters, biographies to meet the real man behind the legend, David Henry Thoreau.
And wait, he actually flipped his first and middle names after college, right?
He did, yeah. He decided he wanted to be Henry David. And actually, based on historical journals from his neighbors, even the way we say his last name today is, well, it's a misunderstanding. Yeah, the 19th century pronunciation wasn't the modern, Thoreau. It was pronounced Thoreau or Thoreau. One of his contemporaries, Amos Bronson Alcott, he actually wrote in his journal in 1860, he said he is rightly named Thoreau.
Thoreau. Wow, that kind of instantly changes the perception of him, doesn't it?
It does. It implies this sense of deep, pervasive, almost exhausting energy.
I love that because the popular kind of sanitized version of Thoreau, it can sometimes feel like a 19th century version of like a modern van life influencer.
Oh, that is a perfect analogy.
You know the phenomenon I mean. Someone posting heavily edited photos, claiming to be completely off-grid, hashtag solitary life.
While secretly parked in their parents' driveway using the Wi-Fi.
Exactly. But the historical reality is, as always, infinitely more complex in a curated aesthetic. So to understand how this contradictory figure became a global icon, I feel like we have to look at the inciting incident of his adult life.
Right, which begins with this stubborn college kid who just refuses to play by the institutional rules, and then a sudden devastating tragedy.
So looking at his early life in Concord, Massachusetts, he was born in 1817 into a pretty modest family. His father was a pencil maker.
Right.
He makes it to Harvard College, but he completely rejects the traditional Ivy League compliance. Like, my absolute favorite detail from his college years is his refusal to pay the $5 fee for his master's diploma.
Yeah, which, by the way, $5 back then was roughly equivalent to maybe $160 today.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Harvard required graduates to pay it essentially just to prove their, quote, earning or inheriting quality. I mean, it was just a status check.
A total flex.
Huh?
And because the diplomas were printed on sheepskin vellum, Thoreau famously declared, "Let every sheep keep its own skin."
And he just walked away without the physical degree.
He really did. He viewed the institutional validation as basically a complete scam.
And that rejection sort of established a baseline for his entire early adulthood, right?
Exactly. The traditional professions open to a Harvard grad at the time, law, the church, business, medicine. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with them.
Mm-hmm. He did join the faculty of a public school in Concord, but he quit almost immediately.
Wait, why did he quit?
Well, the school required him to administer corporal punishment to the students, and he flatly refused to beat children.
I mean, good for him. So instead, he and his older brother, John, who, by the way, he absolutely idolized, they opened their own progressive grammar school called the Concord Academy.
Right, this was in 1838.
Yeah, and they were taking kids on nature walks, visiting local businesses. It was this hands-on experiential learning that was just way ahead of its time.
It was an idyllic setup, but it came to a sudden, horrific end in 1842. His brother John was just, he was shaving, and he accidentally cut himself.
Just a normal nick from a razor.
Exactly, a minor nick. but he contracted tetanus.
And John died at age 27, literally physically in Henry's arms, which, I mean, if you experience that kind of profound random loss in your 20s, it has to completely shatter your worldview.
Oh, without a doubt.
A shaving cut ends a life. It proves that you simply don't have time to live a life you hate. And looking at the sources, this really seems to be the origin of his famous existential urgency. You know, the obsessive need to, as he said, suck out all the marrow of life.
Because grief of that magnitude demands a completely new philosophical framework. The standard American path just suddenly looked absurd to him.
Right. Why bother climbing the corporate ladder if a shaving nick can take you out tomorrow?
Exactly. And that restless search for meaning pulled Thoreau directly into the orbit of a man who lived just down the street from him, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Ah, Emerson.
Yeah, Emerson was 14 years older, already this established intellectual heavy hitter, and he took the grieving Thoreau into his household in 1841. He hired him to work as a handyman, a tutor, and a gardener.
And Emerson is the one who introduces him to transcendentalism. Now, for anyone listening who maybe glazes over a bit when they hear 19th century philosophical terms, what is the actual mechanism of transcendentalism? Like, how does it work?
Sure, so it was a radical break from the strict doctrine-heavy puritanical history of New England.
Okay.
The core mechanism is essentially the belief that divine truth isn't found in a church or, reading a dusty scripture. It is found through personal intuition and direct experience with nature.
So nature is the conduit.
Right. Nature is the outward sign of inward spirit. By stripping away all your societal conditioning and just immersing yourself in the natural world, you can tap into a higher transcendent spiritual reality.
It's almost like open source spirituality. You don't need the priest as a middleman. You just need to walk in the woods to download the truth directly from the universe.
That is a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And Emerson's house was basically functioning like a 19th century startup incubator for these radical thinkers.
Right. You've got Margaret Fuller and Bronson Alcott brainstorming in the living room.
Yeah, and Thoreau is kind of the promising young founder who is given the space to figure out his philosophy. Emerson is actually the one who pushes him to start keeping his famous journal.
So out of this intellectual incubator, the Walden experiment finally takes shape. On July 4th, 1845, Thoreau moves into a small house he built in the woods around Walden Pond.
Which is where the myth of the isolated wilderness survivalist really needs a reality check.
Big time. Because the cabin was built on a 14-acre woodlot that Emerson actually owned.
Right.
And it was just a mile and a half from his family's home in Concord. He could walk to town in 20 minutes. He constantly had visitors. There were reports that his mom supposedly brought him donuts.
Yeah, the donut delivery really ruins the wilderness illusion. But he was not rejecting civilization. Scholars actually refer to his position as a pastoral middle ground.
A middle ground. What does that mean in practice?
Well, he intentionally placed himself on the edge of town to act as sort of a didactic arbitrator. He needed to be close enough to humanity to report back on what he was learning from the woods.
Right, he's not disappearing. He's just stepping into the other room to focus. He also had a very practical, kind of hidden motive for moving to the cabin, because people assume he went there just to observe birds and write Walden.
Yeah, that's the common assumption.
But his first major project out there was actually writing a book called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, which was an elegy to his dead brother John.
Because the isolation was honestly a strategy to process his profound grief.
Yeah.
And he finishes the manuscript, he takes it to a publisher, and he just couldn't get a traditional deal. So Emerson advised him to pay out of pocket to self-publish 1,000 copies.
Which was a catastrophic commercial failure. He sold fewer than 300 copies.
Ouch.
The publisher actually eventually dumped the remaining 700 copies physically back onto Thoreau's doorstep.
That is brutal.
It is. But he managed to joke about it later in his journal. He said something like he had a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which he wrote himself.
Deflecting the pain of failure with humor. It's very human. But while he was out at Walden, trying to write and grieve and, observe nature, the political turmoil of the outside world literally walked right up to his cabin door.
It did. In July 1846, Thoreau runs into the local tax collector, a guy named Sam Staples. And Staples asks Thoreau to pay 6 years of delinquent poll taxes. And Thoreau just flat out refuses.
We should probably pause right here to explain what a poll tax actually was.
Yeah.
And we also need to explicitly note for you listening that we are impartially reporting Thoreau's historical political views Based on the sources here, we aren't endorsing or taking sides on the political issues themselves.
Absolutely. We are just looking at the historical record. So what was the tax?
A poll tax was a flat, fixed sum levied on every adult male, completely untethered from property or income.
Okay.
Paying it was essentially a baseline requirement to participate in society, and it was often tied directly to voting rights.
So why did he refuse? The sources show he was drawing a hard moral line against the Mexican-American War and the institution of slavery. He believed the war was an unjust land grab designed to expand slave territory.
Right.
And he refused to let his money fund a state apparatus that was conducting those atrocities.
So Sam Staples arrests him, and Thoreau spends the night in the local jail.
Yeah.
But the very next day, someone, and historians are fairly certain it was his aunt, quietly paid the tax against his wishes, and he was released.
And he was furious about being bailed out, wasn't he?
Oh, he was livid. He wanted the friction of his imprisonment to make a very public point.
There is a deep, deep irony here, because one of the most consequential political essays in human history was born because a guy was basically annoyed that his aunt bailed him out of a 24-hour inconvenience.
It is pretty funny when you put it like that.
But the resulting essay, Civil Disobedience, is an absolute masterpiece of political theory. Can you break down the actual logical argument he makes in that text?
Sure. The mechanism of his argument relies on viewing the government as a machine. Thoreau argued that every machine produces a little bit of friction, which is normal.
Right, nothing is perfect.
Exactly. But when the machine requires you, the individual, to become an active agent of injustice to someone else, he argued you have a strict moral obligation to stop the machine entirely.
So you don't just write a letter to your congressman.
No, you don't wait for a political majority to vote the injustice away. You use your own life as a counter-friction to stop the gears immediately. By withholding his tax, he was withdrawing his compliance from the machine.
And that concept of individual counterfriction scales globally in just an incredible way.
Yeah.
Decades later, a young Mohandas Gandhi read Civil Disobedience while sitting in a South African prison for protesting discrimination.
Wow.
Gandhi adopted the logic, he called it unanswerable, and he literally borrowed the term civil disobedience for his entire movement.
And it doesn't stop there. In 1944, a young Martin Luther King Jr. read the essay at Morehouse College.
Yeah.
King wrote that Thoreau was his very first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. It convinced him that non-cooperation with an evil system is a moral obligation. So a stubborn refusal to pay a local Massachusetts tax collector literally provided the theoretical framework for the 20th century's greatest civil rights movements.
It's unbelievable. And because of that essay, it's really tempting to view Thoreau purely as this theoretical philosopher of noncompliance. But looking through the source material, he was simultaneously a highly practical, data-driven engineer.
He was. Let's talk about the pencil business.
Yes, please. So the family business was struggling, right?
It was, because the graphite sourced in America was incredibly inferior at the time. It was brittle, it smeared easily. So Thoreau applied a rigorous engineering mindset to the problem. He researched European manufacturing and implemented what is known as the Conte process.
How does that process actually work? I always assumed you just shoved lead into wood.
It's a bit more complex. Instead of just using raw graphite, he figured out how to grind the inferior graphite into a superfine powder, mix it with a specific ratio of clay, and bake it.
Oh, okay.
And by altering the amount of clay, he could meticulously control the hardness of the pencil lead. He effectively created the highest quality pencils in America at the time, which completely saved the family business.
That is so cool. And that empirical problem-solving mindset, the guy mixing clay and baking it to find the perfect hardness, is the exact same lens he applied to the natural world.
Definitely.
He was actually an enthusiastic early reader of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and he practically invented the study of forest succession.
Yeah, people in Concord were baffled by this local biological mystery. They noticed that when a pine forest was cut down or burned, an oak forest would seemingly magically grow in its place.
Which makes no sense initially.
Right, but Thoreau used pure forensic observation to solve it.
He basically acted like a biological supply chain detective. He realized you have to track the acorn. Oak trees are heavy, their seeds don't just blow in the wind like dandelion seeds.
So how did they get there?
He discovered that local squirrels were carrying acorns far from the oak trees and burying them deep in the pine forest to create food stashes for the winter.
And if the squirrel forgot the stash or, was eaten by a predator, those acorns were perfectly positioned in the soil.
Exactly. The moment the pine canopy was removed by fire or logging, sunlight hit the forest floor and the oak seeds germinated. Thoreau documented this complex ecosystem interaction long before ecology was even a formalized science.
Which is brilliant. But this quiet, pragmatic scientist, tracking squirrels and baking pencil lead, stands in fierce contrast to the political radical he became later in life.
He really shifted gears.
He did. The systems thinker who analyzed the forest began to heavily analyze the broken moral system of the United States. And his approach to that friction we talked about shifted dramatically.
In 1859, the radical abolitionist militia leader John Brown raided the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, intending to start an armed slave revolt.
Right.
And following the raid's failure, many prominent voices in the abolitionist movement immediately distanced themselves from Brown, calling him extreme or insane.
But Thoreau delivered a fiery speech called A Plea for Captain John Brown. He completely doubled down, comparing Brown to an angel of light and explicitly likening his execution to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
Which was a massive escalation.
Huge. His philosophy moved from passive tax resistance to active support for armed intervention. He basically argued that you couldn't just let peace rust on your swords while human beings were enslaved. Sometimes morality required keeping those swords bright and sharp.
And his uncompromising defense actually helped shift Northern public opinion, transforming John Brown from a fringe extremist into a martyr.
The spectrum of his life is staggering. From a man preaching peaceful solitude at Walden Pond to a fiery proponent of armed rebellion just a decade later.
It is, and that complexity, the sheer difficulty of categorizing him, it extends deeply into his private life as well.
Oh, his personal life is full of historical ambiguity. He never married. In 1840, he did propose to an 18-year-old woman named Ellen Sewell, but she refused him on the advice of her father.
Right. And then later, a woman named Sophia Ford proposed to him, and he firmly rejected her.
So contemporaries and modern critics have debated his sexuality endlessly. Scholars point to homoerotic sentiments running through his private journals and writings.
Yeah, there was an intense elegy inspired by an 11-year-old boy who stared with his family. And then there are the long, almost romanticized descriptions of a French-Canadian woodchopper in Walden.
Bronson Alcott wrote that Thoreau, quote, seemed to have no temptations. Some scholars suggest he possessed a secret self, experiencing desires that profoundly conflicted with the intense moral reform movements of 19th century New England, which probably led to internal anxiety.
Though, to be clear, there is no definitive historical evidence that he ever had physical relations with anyone. But there is a modern analytical lens applied to Thoreau that sheds light on his behavior in a completely different way. Some scholars, particularly within the autistic community, strongly identify with his lived experience.
This is a really fascinating perspective.
The traits his contemporaries dismissed as weird or misanthropic map really fascinatingly onto neurodivergence.
Author Julie Brown, who studies writers on the autism spectrum, points to abundant historical evidence for this. She highlights his profound, almost painful social difficulties, his intense desire for solitude, and his reliance on incredibly strict routines.
You definitely see it in the way he structured his life at Walden. He bragged about his repetitive, simple diet, his limited wardrobe, and the Spartan, unadorned sensory environment of his cabin.
And Brown connects those traits to the desire for sameness, sensory regulation, and the highly restrictive, intense interests like cataloging literally every plant in Concord, which are often seen in autism spectrum disorder.
He constricted his identity largely through oppositional behavior, right? Like rejecting societal norms that simply felt illogical to him.
And his contemporaries definitely punished him for that opposition. The Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson labeled him a skulker, accusing him of slinking into a corner to hoard his virtue rather than engaging with fellow men.
Well,
Yeah, and James Russell Lowell called him a humorless poseur.
a poser, that's harsh. But Thoreau anticipated all of this nosiness. In Walden, he essentially told people to mind their own business regarding what he ate, if he was lonely, or how he spent his money. He just wanted his account of his life to be taken at face value.
Absolutely. And whether viewed as a genius, a hypocrite, a neurodivergent pioneer, or radical, his core character is perhaps best revealed in his final days.
Right. He'd contracted tuberculosis early in life, and it flared up sporadically. In 1860, he caught a severe case of bronchitis after a late-night excursion in a rainstorm, specifically to count the rings on tree stumps.
I mean, contracting a fatal illness because you couldn't stop tracking the data of the forest is the most Thoreau way to go.
It really is. His health declined rapidly after that, but his friends recorded their absolute amazement at his tranquil acceptance of death.
When he was in his final weeks, someone asked him if he had made his peace with God. And Thoreau calmly replied, "I did not know we had ever quarreled."
Wow.
It is the ultimate distillation of his transcendentalist belief. God wasn't a separate entity to reconcile with, but the nature he had lived with in his entire life.
He passed away on May 6, 1862, at just 44 years old, and his final fading words were, "Now comes good sailing," followed by two fragmented words, moose and Indian.
His mind was analyzing the wild, right up to the final electrical impulses of his brain.
He wasn't globally famous when he died, but his legacy just compounded over time. Beyond civil rights, his ideas laid the groundwork for the national park system, influenced the British labor movement, inspired the 1960s counterculture, and even provide foundational texts for modern libertarians.
Everyone claims a piece of the man. But there's an essay he was preparing right before he died, published posthumously, called Life Without Principle, that contains a really thought-provoking challenge for anyone listening today.
Yes. In that essay, Thoreau challenges the entire mechanical foundation of how we view work. He argued that working purely for a wage, rather than for the love and mastery of the craft itself, was a tragic waste of a human life.
He warned against market forces that actively reward people for doing things, as he put it, coarsely and not too well.
He provides this brilliant example. As a land surveyor, his employers often asked him to do the job inaccurately, just to give them the most land on paper. And he also tried to teach a local firewood seller a mathematical way to measure wood accurately. The seller refused, explaining that buyers actually preferred coarse, inaccurate measurements because every buyer secretly hoped to gain a fractional advantage in the error.
The inefficiency and the hustle just disgusted him. He wrote, "I see advertisements for active young men, as if activity were the whole of a young man's capital." He believed the aim of a worker shouldn't be to just get a living, but to perform a task beautifully for the sheer love of it.
So think about your own life for a second. We live in a hyper-connected gig economy. We are bathed in hustle culture, constantly told to monetize our hobbies, optimize our routines, and produce endless content.
It's exhausting.
It is. What would the man who built the best pencils in America, just for the sake of doing it right, say about how you are spending the capital of your life? Are you mastering your craft, or are you just measuring the firewood coarsely to make a quick buck?
Answering that requires a level of brutal honesty that most people avoid.
So the next time you see that picturesque influencer online, or you catch yourself romanticizing the idea of escaping to a perfectly isolated cabin, remember the real David Henry Thoreau.
A brilliant engineer, an obsessive scientist, and an angry political radical.
Exactly. A guy who lived a mile from his mom, burned down the woods, and still managed to write the mechanisms of resistance that changed the world.
The messy, contradictory reality of a human life is always more profound than the pristine myth.
Thanks for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. We'll catch you next time.